Hello, welcome back to Urban X-Files. My name is Keith, and today we are going to talk about some of the most haunted hospitals and asylums from around the globe. First hospital in this series is the one and the only Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Sometime in the early 1900s in America, the country was ravaged, as was many Western countries, with tuberculosis, also known as TB. This was a deadly and incurable disease. The bacterial infection caused painful growths in the lungs that made it impossible to breathe, resulting in a slow and painful death, and it was also known as the White Plague. This was a highly contagious disease and can overcome an entire family, and in some cases entire towns had been wiped out. Something needed to be done. This needed to be contained fast, quite similar to how COVID-19 is, but not to the same extent. As we skip forward a decade or so, when Waverly Hills Sanatorium had begun, and it was established on a high hill in Jefferson County in Kentucky, and it was a hospital for the treatment of tuberculosis patients. Doctors and nurses did their best to keep it as self-sufficient as possible and to limit the risk of infection spreading to the surrounding community. They maintained their own essential services, and hospital workers weren't allowed to transfer for fear of spreading the disease. This just wasn't the only hospital, for many other places had their TB hospitals. As soon as Waverly Hills opened, it was overrun with sick patients. The hospital was rebuilt and expanded to meet the ever-growing demand, including the addition of a children's ward. This ward was designed to house children with tuberculosis, as well as children of other sick patients who had no one else to care for them. Diagnosis of TB often meant a death sentence. This was long before the days of antibiotics. Doctors were at a loss on how to treat this disease. Their best ways to treat this disease, believe it or not, was simple fresh air, rest, and lots of nutrition. And this was thought to be the best treatments, especially fresh air. It was so important that the patients were often placed on open patios in front of open windows, regardless of the weather. Fresh air was more important than staying out of the snow. As the illness progressed, more desperate measures were required. Exposing a patient's lungs to ultraviolet light in so-called sunrooms was one awful common treatment. An alternative method involved placing balloons inside a patient's lungs and filling them to encourage the lungs to breathe. Then, the last resort, as doctors called it, was surgically removing some ribs and the surrounding muscle tissue to ease the pressure on the lungs. I must say, patients very rarely survived this treatment. For these cases, such nurses had the death tunnel, a 500-foot chute used to lower the dead bodies out of the hospital and into the bottom of the hill. And it wasn't just used for convenience, it helped protect the other patients' mental health. The sight of many dead bodies leaving throughout the front door would have been devastating for patient morale. So patients were placed in this chute to be disposed of, where they were unable to bury for fear of contamination. Unfortunately, it was just business as usual at Waverly Hills. and this was a common sight until it closed its doors finally in 1961. New antibiotic treatments managed to do what UV exposure and the cutting out of body parts was unable to do, and TB became almost completely eradicated. Unfortunately for the patients of Waverly Hills, many of them entered the hospital by the front door and sadly left via the death tunnel. Keeping up with the disease left most records in disorder, so no one knows exactly how many people died within Waverly Hills. Speculators estimate over 60,000 bodies left through the death chute, but other historians opt for a more modest 10,000 deaths, which I believe the first is probably more likely. After the TB hospital had closed its doors, Waverly Hills was reopened as a geriatric centre called Woodhaven. No one paid too much attention to what went on in the facility after that by the state because of patient neglect. For 20 years, Waverly Hills lay vacant. Well, almost. Despite its disuse, crumbling walls, and increasingly decrepit state, the homeless flocked to Waverly Hills for a dry place to sleep. It also became a favourite haunt of vandals and partygoers looking for a thrill. That's when the stories began. Paranormal sightings at Waverly Hills began as whispers in the Jefferson County community, mysterious doors slamming, lights on when there was no power to the building, the sound of footprints tapping, walking along the corridors, and nobody was there. Disembodied voices. No one paid the ramblings of the hoodlums and the homeless much mind, but the stories became more frequent. They could no longer be ignored. They even picked the interest of a ghost hunting society who came to investigate the hospital and bring its secrets to the public. Since then, the sanatorium has been dubbed as one of the most haunted places in the world. And maybe that's because you don't even have to venture inside the building to spot something eerie. Countless people have seen the same desperate spectral woman running out of the front entrance of Waverly Hills. Witnesses saw her hands and legs were bound by chains, dripping from blood that were wrapped round her wrists and ankles. She screams desperately for help, and then she disappears into the night air. Could she have been one of the many TB victims who sadly died at the hospital? Or was she one of the unfortunate tortured residents of the prison-like geriatric home that followed after its closure? No one knows. One thing is for sure, that the wailing woman is not alone. Spectral appearances and countless children, like young victims of TB, have been seen and witnessed by many. Many visitors have heard the sounds of children laughing and playing and singing songs like Ring Around the Rosie. When visitors investigated the strange sounds, no one was to be found. It makes sense that the spirits of the children might linger on. They were often taken up to the roof for heliotherapy, where doctors exposed them to sun and fresh air in hopes of controlling the TB outbreak. More sinister children can be found deeper within the building. In fact, this is on the 3rd floor. The ghost of a young girl has been seen many times that visitors have given her the name Mary. Mary appears in different ways to different people, maybe depending on her mood. Sometimes visitors find her harmlessly, though eerily playing in the hall with a ball. Sometimes she's just there, watching, waiting. The account of one terrified visitor showed a different side of Mary the ghost. for that person found a more disturbing Mary in one of the rooms on the 3rd floor and claimed after Mary wasn't normal, the little girl appeared to have no eyes, just black, gaping sockets where eyes once were. Witnesses report the visitor ran screaming from the building and refused to return. Many believe her story, since other witnesses have also reported seeing the same girl. Mary is not the only little one roaming around Waverly Hills Asylum. On the upper levels, just 1 floor up, lurks the ghost of Timmy. He's been seen and discussed so much over the years that it's hard to figure out fact from fiction, but legend has it that he was 7 years old when he died at Waverly Hills Sanatorium from TB, and he's been there ever since. Like Mary, Timmy has also been seen playing with a ball in the hallways, but has become more famous for it since it's the only thing he ever seems to want to do. Visitors often bring balls with them to the 4th floor in an attempt to make communication. Sometimes balls seem to move on their own. Others, you can hear a ball bouncing and the sound of boys' laughter. Several photos taken up on the 4th floor have appeared on the internet, which show an eerie face of a young boy peering around the corner. Sadly, dying at such a young age, Timmy will be forever a child, one who just wants to play, even if he can't manage to depart from the hospital. A few ghostly children might seem harmless enough, but the 5th floor never fails to fear. The floor looks normal enough, with a couple nurses' stations and patient rooms. Legend also has it on the 5th floor is where the doctors house the TB patients who'd gone mad from their suffering, though no one can say for sure. Reports of strange shapes, disembodied voices, and unexplained sounds are more common on this floor than any floor. Hands down, the most mysterious and ghostly part of the floor, possibly the building, is room 502. Even just approaching it, visitors often feel incredibly uncomfortable, overwhelmed with a sense of despair that would make sense considering the awful history the room holds. Legend, again, says that in 1928, a nurse was found in the room, hung by the neck from a light fixture. Was this suicide? The woman had become pregnant out of wedlock by one of the doctors of the hospital. Depression overtook her, and rather than admit the shame of being pregnant and not married, she took her own life, and that of her unborn child. Or was it the doctor for fear of his affair escaping out? No one knows, but that wasn't the end of the despair for room 502. For in 1930, an other nurse jumped out of the window, plunging to her death. But unlike the previous woman, no one knows why this nurse would have taken her own life. People at the time speculated that she may have been pushed out. No one was ever able to solve the mystery of the nurse who jumped from the sanatorium. Now, it would seem that one or both nurses who lost their lives in that room still linger there today. Some have witnessed a complete apparition of a woman in white lingering in the doorway of room 502. Others have seen strange shadows and heard whispers. One thing's for sure is that room 502 is not a welcoming place. Often the door slams on its own accord, and many have heard a clear and firm voice say, "Get out." Visitors can't help but wonder if that's what the nurse heard before she was pushed from the window. Nowadays, it's not possible to wander through Waverly Hills on your own. You have to go on a guided tour. With Waverly Hills' long history of disease, suffering, patient neglect, and untimely deaths, the residents never stop trying to make their story heard. Recently, the hospital was purchased by a private couple who plan to convert it into a 4-star hotel for guests, for ghost lovers and thrill seekers. And the big question is, will the nurses allow anyone to reside in room 502? Would you stay the night in room 502? Only time will tell. I hope you enjoyed this part of one of the most haunted hospitals in the world. Take care and see you all in the next video. Peace.